The story of the American Revolution is filled with remarkable individuals whose courage, vision, and ingenuity changed the course of history. Among the figures who stand out for their unconventional strategies and daring operations, one man became legendary for using what seemed like impossible tactics in a war where survival often depended on creativity and grit rather than numbers and brute force. This man was Marion, known to both his friends and enemies as the Swamp Fox. His name carries an almost mythical resonance because at a time when the British Army appeared unstoppable and the cause of American independence was teetering on the edge of collapse, Marion and his small band of irregular fighters proved that imagination and mobility could defeat overwhelming force. His exploits were not just military victories, they were acts of psychological warfare that inspired a weary people to believe that freedom was still within reach. To understand how one man's methods helped save the American Revolution, one must first appreciate the dire situation the Patriots faced in the South, the brutal nature of the conflict there, and the way Marion transformed the swamps and forests of the Carolinas into weapons against the mightiest empire of the age. By 1780, the war had dragged on for 5 years, and while the northern campaigns around Boston, New York, and Philadelphia had brought mixed results, the British shifted their strategy toward the South. They believed that the Carolinas and Georgia contained large numbers of loyalists who would support the crown if given the chance. Charleston fell in May 1780, delivering a devastating blow to the Patriot cause. Thousands of American troops were captured, and British General Cornwallis prepared to consolidate control over the Carolinas before moving north. The rebellion seemed near collapse in the region. Into this bleak picture stepped Marion, not a commanding general of a grand army, but a wiry man of unremarkable physical appearance who would soon earn a reputation that terrified Redcoats and inspired patriots alike. Marion was born in 1732 in South Carolina to a modest family of French Huguenot descent. He was not a man of wealth or political stature, but he was hardened by frontier life. As a young man, he had fought against the Cherokee during earlier colonial wars, where he learned the value of irregular fighting, hit-and-run attacks, and how terrain could be turned into an ally. These lessons would resurface with explosive effect during the Revolution. When war with Britain erupted, Marion initially served in the state militia and later joined the Continental Army, fighting in campaigns such as the Siege of Savannah. Yet it was after Charleston fell, when the Continental Army in the South lay shattered, that Marion truly stepped into the role for which history remembers him. Unlike many Patriot leaders, Marion did not surrender after the fall of Charleston. Instead, he withdrew into the countryside and began assembling a small force of volunteers. His men were often farmers, hunters, and frontiersmen who brought their own horses and weapons. They lacked uniforms, regular pay, and formal training, but they had something far more valuable: local knowledge of the swamps, rivers, and forests of South Carolina. Marion molded these men into a guerrilla force that could move with astonishing speed, strike where the enemy least expected, and then vanish into the wilderness before retaliation could come. It was from these very tactics that British Lieutenant Colonel Banastra Tarleton, frustrated after chasing Marion through nearly 30 miles of swampy ground only to come up empty, gave him the nickname Swamp Fox. The name was meant as an insult, but it became a badge of honor that perfectly captured Marion's elusive genius. Marion's tactics were revolutionary for their time. Traditional European warfare emphasized set-piece battles, rigid formations, and control of cities. Marion rejected all of this. He refused to engage in battles he could not win, instead preferring ambushes, raids on supply lines, and surprise attacks on isolated garrisons. His men would sweep in, capture prisoners, destroy supplies, and then disappear. These operations had enormous consequences. The British Army, stretched thin in hostile territory, relied heavily on supply convoys and communications between scattered outposts. Marion's relentless strikes disrupted these lifelines, forcing Cornwallis to divert troops to chase an enemy that refused to stand and fight in conventional ways. Even when Marion's men lost skirmishes, their ability to melt away into the swamps meant they were never decisively defeated. What made Marion's leadership so remarkable was not only his tactical brilliance, but also his ability to maintain the loyalty and spirit of his ragtag force under the harshest conditions. His men endured hunger, exposure, and constant danger. Marion himself lived as austerely as his soldiers, sharing their hardships. His integrity and fairness became legendary. He never allowed plundering of civilians, and he treated prisoners with humanity, in stark contrast to the brutality often displayed by loyalist militias or British dragoons. This moral authority gave his men a sense of higher purpose, binding them to him not through fear or pay, but through respect. The impact of Marion's actions rippled far beyond the swamps. His constant harassment of the British kept hope alive among patriots who otherwise might have given up. Local farmers, emboldened by his example, joined the resistance or provided food, shelter, and intelligence. Loyalist militias, once seen as a powerful arm of British control, found themselves vulnerable and demoralized when Marion's men targeted them. The psychological effect on the British was equally profound. Cornwallis lamented how one small band of rebels could so effectively tie down his forces. Marion demonstrated that the revolution was not dead in the South, and his efforts bought precious time until the Continental Army, under leaders like Nathaniel Greene, could regroup and re-enter the field. One of Marion's most celebrated operations occurred at Nelson's Ferry on the Santee River. There, his men struck a British column, freeing 150 American prisoners and capturing supplies before vanishing into the swamp. Acts like these had an outsized effect. Each victory, though small in scale, resonated across the countryside, proving that the British were not invincible. When General Greene took command of the Southern Army, he relied heavily on partisans like Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens to keep pressure on the enemy. These guerrilla leaders complemented Greene's own strategy of avoiding pitched battles, while gradually bleeding Cornwallis's forces. Without Marion's contributions, Greene's strategy might not have succeeded, and Cornwallis may have secured the Carolinas. Marion's legacy also lies in his influence on the evolution of American military doctrine. His blending of local knowledge, irregular tactics, and psychological warfare foreshadowed principles that would later define guerrilla warfare worldwide. The idea that a small, mobile force, using the environment to its advantage, could tie down a larger army became a lesson repeated throughout history, from the partisan fighters of Europe in World War II to resistance movements across the globe. In Marion's time, these methods seemed impossible to the rigid military minds of Europe, but he proved they could achieve strategic results. By the time Cornwallis marched into Virginia, his southern campaign undermined by constant resistance, Marion's contributions were undeniable. While others would win the climactic victory at Yorktown, the Swamp Fox's earlier campaigns had ensured that Cornwallis's army was battered, supply lines fractured, and morale weakened. The revolution had been saved in part by one man's refusal to fight on the enemy's terms. After the war, Marion retired quietly, never seeking great honors or wealth. He served modestly in the South Carolina Senate and lived out his life on his plantation. Yet the legend of the Swamp Fox grew. Generations of Americans would remember him not only as a military hero, but as a symbol of ingenuity, persistence, and the idea that even when the odds seem impossible, boldness and imagination can tip the scales. His story became a foundational myth of the American identity, the belief that ordinary men and women, guided by a cause greater than themselves, could defy the strongest powers in the world. In reflecting on Marion's role, one cannot help but marvel at how history can hinge on the actions of individuals. The revolution was a vast conflict involving armies, foreign alliances, and grand strategy, yet in the swamps of South Carolina, it often came down to the grit of one small force, led by a man with unshakable resolve. Marion's genius was not in commanding vast armies, but in making the impossible possible. His tactics were not simply military maneuvers, they were acts of defiance that told the world that the American spirit would not be broken. When we speak of the revolution as a triumph of freedom against tyranny, the story of the Swamp Fox stands as proof that victory sometimes belongs to those who refuse to fight by the rules imposed upon them. The legend of the Swamp Fox continues to echo in American culture, from stories passed down through families in the South to films and books that celebrate his daring. He remains a figure who embodies both the cunning of a warrior and the resilience of a people struggling for independence. His tactics, once dismissed as irregular, are now studied in military academies as lessons in asymmetric warfare. More importantly, his life reminds us that the fate of nations can rest on the shoulders of individuals who refuse to surrender, who dare to imagine new ways of fighting when all seems lost. Francis Marion's contribution to the American Revolution is a testament to how determination and innovation can overcome overwhelming odds. His impossible tactics were not only possible, but decisive, saving the revolution at its darkest hour. He showed that true leadership is not measured by titles or numbers, but by vision, courage, and the ability to inspire. In the end, the Swamp Fox did more than outmaneuver his enemies. He proved that freedom can be won by those willing to risk everything in its pursuit.
The dire state of the American Revolution in the South, after the fall of Charleston in 1780. By the year 1780, the American Revolution faced a critical moment, especially in the southern colonies. The fall of Charleston to British forces was not just a defeat, it was a catastrophe. Nearly 5,000 American soldiers were captured, including most of the Continental Army in the South. British General Henry Clinton believed this would cripple the rebellion and open the way for Loyalist control of the region. Cornwallis, his field commander, prepared to sweep through South Carolina, believing Loyalist support would guarantee success. The patriots were scattered, demoralized, and without formal leadership in the region. To many, it seemed the revolution was lost below the Potomac. Guerrilla resistance seemed the only option left, but that required leaders willing to operate outside the norms of traditional warfare. In this bleak context, Francis Marion emerged. With no real army, no supplies, and little hope of conventional victory, he recognized that survival required ingenuity. The dire state of the South created both the necessity and the opportunity for a different kind of warfare, one not dependent on numbers or artillery, but on speed, surprise, and the knowledge of local terrain. Without the desperation of 1780, Marion's tactics might never have taken root. Early life of Francis Marion, and lessons from frontier warfare against Native Americans. Francis Marion's childhood and early experiences prepared him uniquely for the role he would later play in the Revolution. Born in 1732 to a French Huguenot family in South Carolina, he grew up in a world where survival often depended on toughness, self-reliance, and adaptability. As a boy, he was described as small and frail, but he gained resilience through frontier living. His first military service came during the French and Indian War, when he joined expeditions against the Cherokee. It was here that Marion encountered the kind of warfare that would leave a permanent impression on him. The Cherokee did not fight in ordered ranks or seek open-field battles. They used ambushes, surprise raids, and knowledge of the wilderness to inflict damage before vanishing into forests and mountains. European officers often saw this as savage or unmanly, but Marion recognized its effectiveness. He learned how mobility and terrain could neutralize superior numbers. The lessons of stealth, patience, and striking at vulnerable points would later form the foundation of his revolutionary strategy. More importantly, his exposure to irregular warfare taught him to value adaptability over rigid military doctrines, a mindset that set him apart from many of his contemporaries. Formation of Marion's small irregular force of volunteers after Charleston's surrender. After the devastating surrender of Charleston, most Patriot leaders either became prisoners or fled. Marion, recovering from an injury, avoided capture and returned to the countryside. He began quietly assembling a small group of men willing to continue the fight. Unlike the Continental Army, this was not a force of trained soldiers in uniforms. His recruits were farmers, woodsmen, and hunters, ordinary men bringing their own weapons, horses, and supplies. Many had personal reasons to fight: British confiscation of land, loyalist persecution, or the brutal tactics of enemy militias. Marion's leadership quickly transformed this collection of individuals into a cohesive fighting unit. They were bonded less by formal discipline than by shared trust and respect for their commander's resourcefulness. Their lack of conventional military structure became an advantage. Because they had no uniforms, they blended easily into the civilian population. Because they carried their own weapons, they required little formal supply. And because they operated in small numbers, they could move with extraordinary speed and stealth. This force would never stand toe-to-toe with British regulars in open battle, but that was precisely the point. It was built to strike suddenly, achieve its objective, and then disappear into the wilderness. Use of swamps, rivers, and forests of South Carolina as tactical weapons. Francis Marion's genius lay in his ability to turn the geography of South Carolina into a formidable ally. The region was laced with rivers, creeks, and dense swamplands that made traditional military maneuvers nearly impossible. For regular armies used to roads, supply wagons, and open battlefields, these landscapes were nightmares. For Marion, they became sanctuaries. He and his men knew how to move silently through swamps, using narrow trails invisible to outsiders. They established hidden camps in areas inaccessible to heavy cavalry or supply wagons. Rivers became highways for quick movement, allowing sudden strikes against British posts along the Santee and Pedee rivers. Dense forests provided cover for ambushes, where muskets could erupt from behind trees before the enemy had time to form lines. Even when pursued, Marion could vanish into the wetlands, where cavalry and artillery could not follow. The swamps provided food, concealment, and safety, turning geography into a weapon as effective as muskets or sabers. This mastery of terrain was so complete that British officers came to dread operations in the Carolina backcountry. It was not just the men they faced, but the land itself, shaped and controlled by the swamp fox's cunning. Banastra Tarleton's failed pursuit and the origin of the nickname Swamp Fox. One of the most famous episodes of Marion's career came when British cavalry officer Banastra Tarleton pursued him across nearly 30 miles of swampland. Tarleton, known for his ruthlessness, believed he could corner Marion and crush his small band once and for all. Yet each time he thought he had the Patriots within reach, Marion would vanish into the swamp, leaving behind only muddy tracks and exhausted soldiers. After days of fruitless pursuit, Tarleton finally gave up in frustration, declaring that the devil himself could not catch this damned old fox. The phrase was reported widely, and soon Francis Marion was known across the colonies as the Swamp Fox. The name was meant as a sneer, but it became a title of respect, embodying his elusive tactics and ability to defy conventional pursuit. For patriots, the nickname was inspiring. It painted Marion as a folk hero who could outwit even the fiercest British officers. For the British, it became a symbol of frustration, representing a foe who refused to fight by the rules and could not be pinned down. The legend of the Swamp Fox was born from this encounter, cementing Marion's reputation as a master of the impossible. Marion's rejection of traditional European warfare in favor of guerrilla tactics. The Revolutionary War was fought largely according to European military doctrines, with set-piece battles, formal lines, and rigid formations. Marion rejected this approach entirely. He knew his small band of men could never survive a traditional battle against disciplined British regulars, supported by artillery and cavalry. Instead, he embraced guerrilla tactics that seemed alien and dishonorable to European officers, but were perfectly suited to the circumstances. His men avoided direct confrontation, preferring to strike quickly at isolated targets before withdrawing. They ambushed convoys, attacked foraging parties, and cut off communications. They harassed without committing to large engagements, forcing the enemy to expend energy and resources without ever achieving a decisive victory. This was warfare on Marion's terms, not the British. It was an early example of asymmetric conflict, where a weaker force exploits speed, mobility, and terrain to undermine a stronger foe. While critics called it cowardly, the results spoke for themselves. By refusing to play by the enemy's rules, Marion preserved his force, sustained the rebellion in the South, and forced the British into a war of attrition they could not win. His approach was unconventional, but it was precisely what the Revolution needed: ambushes, raids on supply lines, and surprise attacks on British outposts. One of the hallmarks of Marion's strategy was his focus on ambushes and raids that disrupted the British war machine. Rather than attempt to seize cities or fortifications, he targeted the vulnerable arteries of the British campaign: supply lines, communication routes, and small outposts. His men would strike a convoy of wagons, seize food and ammunition, and then disappear before reinforcements arrived. They would ride into a lightly defended garrison under cover of darkness, overwhelm it in minutes, and retreat before dawn. These attacks forced the British to spread their forces thin, guarding every road and bridge, which slowed their operations and sapped their strength. For Marion's men, each raid was a morale boost and a source of much-needed supplies. For the enemy, it was a constant source of anxiety, never knowing when or where the Swamp Fox might strike next. The psychological toll of these raids was immense, wearing down the patience and confidence of British troops. Marion showed that one did not need to win grand battles to have a decisive impact. A series of small, relentless blows could bleed an empire dry. His raids became legendary, celebrated by patriots and feared by loyalists. Liberation of prisoners at Nelson's Ferry, and other notable skirmishes. Among Marion's many exploits, the raid at Nelson's Ferry on the Santee River stands out as one of his most daring. In a swift, coordinated attack, Marion and his men struck a British column transporting American prisoners. The assault freed 150 captives and captured a haul of supplies. The operation demonstrated Marion's ability to combine speed, intelligence, and boldness for maximum effect. It also highlighted his humane priorities. Liberating fellow patriots lifted morale across the South and showed that even in defeat, Americans were not abandoned. Other notable actions included strikes at Georgetown, where Marion disrupted enemy control of the coast, and ambushes at Blue Savannah and Black Mingo Creek, where his men inflicted heavy casualties before withdrawing into the swamp. Each of these skirmishes may have seemed minor in isolation, but together they created a drumbeat of resistance that undermined British authority. They also made Marion's name synonymous with defiance. These operations spread word of his prowess far beyond South Carolina, inspiring fighters across the colonies. In every instance, Marion showed that his men could appear where least expected, achieve their objectives, and slip away before the enemy could react. Disruption of British communications and supply networks. The British war effort in the South depended heavily on secure lines of communication and steady flows of supplies. Cornwallis needed food, ammunition, reinforcements, and information to control such a vast territory. Marion understood this and made it his mission to cut those lifelines whenever possible. His men attacked messengers, captured dispatches, and destroyed boats and bridges along key rivers. They intercepted convoys carrying food or arms, seizing what they needed and denying the rest to the enemy. By targeting logistics rather than seeking large battles, Marion created a constant strain on British operations. Cornwallis often found himself unable to coordinate with distant outposts or forced to delay campaigns while waiting for supplies. The disruption was not just material, but psychological. British officers could not trust that orders would reach their destinations or that supplies would arrive on time. This insecurity weakened their control over occupied territory and emboldened Patriot sympathizers to resist. In many ways, Marion waged a war of nerves as much as muskets. By keeping the enemy uncertain and unstable, he magnified the effect of his small force, proving that the destruction of supply lines could be as decisive as victory on the battlefield. Marion's leadership qualities, austerity, fairness, and humane treatment of prisoners. What made Francis Marion truly exceptional was not just his tactics but his character as a leader. He lived as austerely as his men, often surviving on meager rations of sweet potatoes or roasted corn. This shared hardship built loyalty, as his soldiers knew he did not ask of them what he would not endure himself. Unlike some partisan leaders, Marion enforced strict discipline against looting or abusing civilians. Recognizing that the support of local populations was vital to survival, his fairness extended to his treatment of prisoners. While the war in the South was notorious for brutality, with loyalist and patriot militias often engaging in massacres, Marion insisted on humane treatment of captives. This earned him a reputation for honor, even among enemies, and further strengthened the moral legitimacy of his cause. His ability to inspire loyalty was remarkable, especially given that his men received no regular pay and lived under constant danger. They followed him because they trusted him, admired him, and believed in his vision. Leadership of this kind cannot be bought or imposed. It arises from character. Marion's integrity ensured that his force remained cohesive and effective, even under the most difficult circumstances. The psychological effect on patriots, loyalists, and the British Army. Marion's campaigns were as much psychological warfare as they were military operations. For patriots, his constant presence in the swamps was a beacon of hope during dark times. News of his raids circulated rapidly, convincing many that the cause was not lost. Local farmers, emboldened by his success, offered food, shelter, and intelligence, creating a support network that sustained the rebellion. For loyalists, the effect was the opposite. They found themselves vulnerable, unable to rely on British protection when Marion's men could strike at any time. Their morale eroded, and many reconsidered their allegiance. For the British Army, Marion was a nightmare. Cornwallis and his officers found their campaigns bogged down by an enemy they could not catch, let alone defeat. Soldiers grew weary of constant harassment, unable to rest or feel secure. The nickname Swamp Fox itself carried a psychological weight, a symbol of an adversary who seemed everywhere and nowhere at once. In this way, Marion multiplied his influence. His military victories were important, but his ability to shape perceptions was equally powerful. By convincing patriots to fight on and sowing doubt among his enemies, he turned psychology into a decisive weapon of war. Coordination with Nathaniel Greene and other partisan leaders like Thomas Sumter. While Marion operated independently for much of the war, his effectiveness increased when Nathaniel Greene took command of the Southern Army. Greene understood the value of partisans like Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens, and he integrated their operations into his broader strategy. Greene's approach was to avoid catastrophic defeats, wear down the British through constant pressure, and stretch their resources to the breaking point. Marion's raids perfectly complemented this plan. By keeping the British occupied in the countryside, he prevented them from consolidating power or focusing solely on Greene's regular forces. Communication between Greene and Marion was steady, with Greene often relying on Marion's intelligence to plan movements. At times, Greene coordinated operations so that Marion's raids would distract the enemy, while the Continental Army maneuvered elsewhere. The relationship was mutually beneficial. Greene gained a flexible and elusive ally, while Marion received legitimacy and occasional reinforcements from the Continental Army. Together with Sumter's hard-hitting militia campaigns and Pickens's frontier raids, Marion created a network of resistance that tied down Cornwallis. This partnership between regular and irregular forces was a key reason the Southern campaign ultimately shifted in favor of the Americans. Strategic contribution to Cornwallis's eventual failure in the Carolinas. Cornwallis entered the Carolinas with confidence, believing he could crush the rebellion and then march north into Virginia. Instead, he found his army bogged down in a grueling war of attrition. Marion's relentless raids on supply lines and communications meant Cornwallis never enjoyed the secure base he needed. Loyalist support, which had seemed promising, withered under the pressure of partisan attacks. Even when Cornwallis won battles, such as at Camden, he could not consolidate control because Marion and his allies kept resistance alive. The constant harassment wore down British morale and resources, making every advance costly. By the time Cornwallis marched into Virginia, his forces were stretched thin, battered, and isolated. The victory at Yorktown in 1781 owed much to this earlier weakening in the South. Marion had ensured that Cornwallis could not stabilize the Carolinas, which forced the British commander to overextend himself in Virginia. Without the Swamp Fox, Cornwallis might have secured the South, cutting off vital resources and manpower from the Revolution.
Instead, Marion's impossible tactics helped set the stage for Britain's ultimate defeat, proving that small-scale resistance could have enormous strategic consequences. Legacy of Francis Marion. As a pioneer of guerrilla warfare and irregular tactics, Francis Marion's legacy extends far beyond his own time. He is remembered not only as a hero of the American Revolution, but as one of the pioneers of guerrilla warfare. His methods of using mobility, local knowledge, and surprise to offset a stronger opponent became a model studied by later generations. Leaders in wars of independence across the world would draw lessons from his example, from Latin America to Southeast Asia. Even modern military academies examine his campaigns as early case studies in asymmetric conflict. But Marion's legacy is also cultural. He became a folk hero in the United States, celebrated in stories, ballads, and eventually film. The Swamp Fox represented the American ideal of ingenuity and resilience, a man who, without wealth or powerful connections, shaped the fate of his country through determination and creativity. His reputation for fairness and honor gave him a moral standing that enhanced his legend. In a war often marked by brutality, his conduct stood out as humane and principled. Thus, Marion's legacy lies not only in his tactics, but in his embodiment of the values that Americans wish to see in their revolution: resourcefulness, courage and integrity, post-war life, modest public service, and enduring legend of the Swamp Fox. After the revolution ended, Marion did not seek glory or riches. He returned to his plantation in South Carolina and married late in life, settling into relative obscurity. He served in the state senate, where he supported rebuilding efforts and policies to stabilize the fragile new republic. Unlike some revolutionary leaders who sought fame or fortune, Marion remained modest, content with a quiet life. Yet his legend grew after his death in 1795. Stories of his daring exploits circulated widely, often embellished to heroic proportions. In the 19th century, writers like Mason Locke Weems, famous for the George Washington cherry tree story, further mythologized Marion, portraying him as a larger-than-life figure. In the 20th century, he was celebrated in television series, novels, and even loosely inspired characters in films. The image of the Swamp Fox as the cunning patriot who outfoxed the British became part of America's revolutionary folklore. His modesty in life only amplified his stature in memory. Marion became not just a man, but a symbol, a reminder that revolutions are often won, not by grand armies alone, but by the determination of those who refuse to surrender, no matter the odds.